All right. Well, welcome
Thanks for having
to,
me.
yeah, thank you for being on the Not Podcast conversation.
I love it.
Yeah. All right. Well, for people who don't know who I am, my name is Josh. I am the editor of theleadpastor.com. Super stoked to be sitting down with a writer for theleadpastor.com. We can call ourselves friends. We've been like having
Yeah,
conversation for like a long time.
basically,
Basically,
basically.
basically.
Unofficial BFFs in a
Unofficial BFFs. Yep.
yeah, yeah.
Ashley Vaughn. And we're gonna have a conversation today, loosely tied to an article you recently wrote, How to Organize a Church Conference. Why don't you just tell people just a teensy bit about yourself and what you're into and your connection with the lead pastor, I guess. And
Yeah, I've been working with the lead pastor for, I guess, a few years now.
Mhm.
I'm been involved in church leadership. I don't know, I swear since like maybe it was in diapers. I don't know. Like my parents were always involved in
Yeah,
churches, and so we were. Anytime the church doors were open, we were there. And my husband and I have been involved in church leadership, particularly worship ministries. We've overseen worship ministries in churches, and yeah, planning many worship conferences and church conferences, and had the joy of being involved in that aspect of leadership as well. And so we got 3 kids, and we just ironically just got back from our church conference yesterday. We had
perfect.
3 nights at a church camp that we took over
Nice.
with our church, and so yeah.
Nice. So maybe using that experience is perfect timing. So you can kind of like riff off of that.
Mhm.
Um, so Um, Something I've kind of like had in my mind is how like the idea of running a church conference, like people hear that, pastors hear that, and their brain goes potentially a million different places. But my default thought is, oh, a church conference is a big thing. I'm usually flying somewhere or driving somewhere out of town, and there's like hundreds of people, big speakers, whatever. But I also know that's not always the case.
Mhm.
And like even as you just described, I think there's a great case for having like an internally focused conference, or like, okay, a family time kind of
Yeah,
conference. Like, okay, this is for us, you know?
yeah.
And that sounds like that's what the conference you were just had. So maybe can you describe the conference you were just at? Um, and think about, okay, what are some of the benefits that you and your church experience as a result of that?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you're totally right. When you hear the word conference, you think of like swag being thrown and smoke machines and like
Merch,
yeah,
merch
exactly.
tables.
Totally. But yeah, for our church, we kind of call it like a weekend away. And we've been doing this now. This I think was like our 12th year that we just had it. And it's been incredible. And it really does become a highlight of our church calendar because it's a weekend that we just go and we like kind of focus on um kind of like what is the mission of our church? Like what is the value of our church? And we'll bring in guest speakers that come
Mhm.
that can like speak into that, like that are, part of the denomination type thing or
Sure.
and our leaders also speak into that. And not only is it a great way to kind of almost like recalibrate of like what are we here for in our city, but also a great way to connect with people because
Yeah.
I think like as we know, like on a Sunday, you can like kind of come and go. And if you're involved in ministry, like on the setup team or like the worship team or the kids work, it's really hard to connect with people. So it's also like 3 days of just intentionally like connecting together as a family. Cause that's what church really is. The beauty of the
Yeah.
church community is that we're a family that does life together and we're on
Yeah.
mission together. And so it has that aspect of it as well. And some great teaching and worship. And there's such value in it. There's like, I
Mhm.
think our church comes out of it stronger. And it's almost, we always do it in September. So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, we're ready for a new year. And so
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I wish more churches like understood the value of that versus like the big conference. Cause I do think there is place and value in big conferences, like whether it's like, pastors getting together and, spurring each other on. But I think I wish more just churches within their own church family created space in the calendar just to grow and strengthen
Mhm.
together as
Yeah. 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 Man, that really resonates to me for a bunch of different reasons. I mean, so uh I'm trying to remember my earliest church memory. I don't I don't remember being in diapers. Um But like like my mom and my grandfather started the church, like he planted the church that I grew up in. And so I mean, I was born in church basically.
Mhm,
Like Wednesday night meetings, Friday night meetings,
mhm.
like we were there all the time.
Yeah.
Um, and there was like one thing that our church did every year. We called it camp meetings. And it
Mhm.
was like a week in the summertime, usually just before like Canada Day. So like the last week of June, early July. So just once kids had gotten out of school,
Yeah.
and the whole church kind of descended on, like we all came out to the church building. So the church building was out in the country and was on like, I think it was like 10 acres or something like that.
Oh,
And
wow.
so everyone actually would camp on site, and like people would just like camp there, go to work during the day, come back. And so I don't know if we can like call that a conference, but what I will say though is it was something that was, I think, hugely valuable for its time, because there was so much, people talk about like doing life together. It's almost a buzzword now in churches.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, for 4 or 5 days, you're actually like living in close proximity with other people, which is, I mean, I've got a million stories of reasons why that's not always a good thing,
Yeah.
but I mean, like, there's such a benefit to being in close proximity for a certain amount of time. And because it's often the unscripted things, it's like I mean, I'm sure this happened for you guys, this recent conference you did where you're at a church camp. Okay, there's an evening session maybe, and then it's done and people are kind of hanging out, right? And it's
Mhm.
like, okay, you get into conversation with someone around the fire and just chilling
Yeah.
out and talk about whatever. It's like this great, incubator time almost
Yeah.
for relationships that
Yeah.
ultimately really do drive a church.
Yes.
It's like those
Yeah.
relationships, those connections.
Yeah.
And that, I think that alone is a great reason
Yeah.
to have some kind of a focused family time, like, and calling it a church conference, maybe you call it something else if the conference freaks you out too much, but
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're totally right, because I remember, like, so my kids are, like, 11, 9, and 7 now, and I
okay.
just remember at like, one time at a conference, and, like, I would see these, like, women at church, and they were always seemed, like, so, calm and, like, put together and, like, so, like, just spiritual and lovely, and then we did a conference, and I saw them, like I remember seeing, like, this mom, like, yell at her kid and be like, "What are you doing?" Like, 'cause like, you're right, like, the tensions flare and the kids are, like, tired and they're
Yeah.
hungry or whatever, and then, like, kind of real life comes,
The
and I
mask
remember
come
being
off.
like, "Oh my goodness, she's just like me," like, I just, like, we are normal people, because I was like, "How do these, like, women they're so incredible and they're so godly, like,
Yeah.
they don't yell at their husbands?" And then I think you see this realness in it and, like, "Oh my goodness," and then you bond of, like, this we're just real people trying to,
Yeah.
like, do ministry and,
Yeah.
and I think for leaders too, it's kind of this pressure of, like, you gotta be this example of, like, a spiritual leader, spiritual authority, but
Yes.
also, like, you're also a real person that,
Yeah.
like, snaps at your spouse or
Mm.
your kid, but, like
Yep.
and I think that is so real and so needed in church communities.
Yeah.
I think there's this pressure in society already of being, like, always putting the best out front or, but we're human and
Yeah.
we're real and we make
Yeah.
mistakes and,
Yeah.
there's value in that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. You're touching on something that's like super close to my heart, because I mean, growing up in the church, my grandfather was a pastor. When I was 14, my dad became the senior pastor. I'm like the oldest of 7 sons. So
Oh,
you can imagine what like people have been telling me my whole life. And so
yeah.
it's just like, oh, you're gonna be a pastor someday. And for a while that was cool. Like when I was a kid, like there's like, and I sort of, I feel sheepish talking like this, but like I kind of, I don't know if I would have called myself a golden boy, like, at the time, but, like, I definitely had like, I took on some of the pressure, like, "Oh, I need to be someone who's gonna be really, really effective," right?
Yeah.
And so as I got older, that, like, I think I'd internalized that so much and it creating this enormous amount of pressure for me as a leader. And,
Mhm.
I am a church leader. I'm a lay pastor now. I helped to plant a church 5 years ago. It's going great, and, um, but I really had to come to grips with the reality that being a pastor can be so lonely and it
Yes.
can be so isolating,
Yes.
as long as the expectations that I have for myself is that I have to be put together and I have to show up for people and I have to perform for people. But the
Yeah.
reality is like God designed me, like my heart is a pastor heart. God made me this way. And
Mhm.
so, you know, like, so for New Life Fellowship, the church that, I'm helping to lead today, like we have our own version of camp meetings. It's not a week because that's way too long.
Yeah.
It's 3 days and the
Okay.
church all kind of descends on a local camp and it's like very loosely structured. There's like games and stuff like that and like contests and we have like meetings and worship time together and that kind of thing. But it's such a time where it's like, okay, we're all like actual normal people. We're all peers.
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
there's a sense, I think, and this is getting off topic, but like, I think in a lot of churches, there's a sense like pastors aren't peers. They're like above,
Mm.
right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
like, and I understand why people feel that way, but at the end of the day, it's like you're not. And like,
Yeah.
um, and so having a conference, kind of like what we're describing, can be such a great, effective way of
Yeah.
developing real relationships that actually like are life giving to leaders and
Yeah.
pastors, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, um, thinking back over the last few days, number one, like, where do you think a lot of where do you think what do you say like mistakes get made or potholes get stepped in? Or what are some of the things that maybe missteps or that people planning conferences should be aware of or should be careful of like going into the process?
Yeah, I think often sometimes the biggest potholes, as you would say, happen when we're too focused on like the structure of the agenda and the schedule versus um also considering the people attending, if that makes sense. Like, we can like be like, okay, we want to make sure that we have breakfast and then we're gonna go have this breakout and then there's gonna be worship service and then oh, this we really want to do this like this youth breakout thing here and like we can be too focused on like agenda because we only have 3 days and we want to get as much done, but also thinking like, does it actually serve the people coming? And you got to think of like the volunteers, like the worship team and the kids ministry team, and like how much time are we expecting them to give? And so sometimes I think it's like taking a step back, like once you've kind of got it figured out and thinking like, okay, like, how much time are we expecting them to eat breakfast and then get to the chapel? Like, should we give a half hour in between so that, if people want to like go brush their teeth after they've eaten, or kids need to like change because they've had an accident, or like, um, and then also, like the worship team, like, oh, are they going to have enough time to have breakfast and then go do a sound check before the worship? Like all these like little details because,
Mm,
we're, yes, the conference is the church, but remember, like, the church is also the one putting on the conference. It's all volunteers as well, and so it's, like, being able that they can get something as well as much as they're putting into it,
mm,
and, I think sometimes and this has happened in I've seen this in huge, big conferences, and I've seen this in smaller church conference camps things as well, where people leave and they're kind of like, "I don't know why I was there," like, "What just happened?" Because you're just going so much and you're expecting, like, people to just get so much in, but it's like yeah, and so I think, I don't know how you would say that, like, considering the people attending,
yeah,
is something that is often overlooked maybe or not valued as much as, like, what are we gonna tell the people or teach them or what are they
yeah,
gonna experience?
yeah. Mm,
And I think too, like the reality of like working with people like volunteers, and I talked about this, like building a strong volunteer team is like really important because like you want people to come, like especially people pay money to go to these church camps. Like it's an investment. And if you got many kids, like it's a bigger investment.
yeah,
And so you want their value of the investment going. And so I think having strong volunteers um running this is really important as well because people are also human and make
yeah,
mistakes. And so you want to make sure that the people that are running the ministries are running, the setup are people that you can count on because as much as there is grace, like you also don't want it to be like, oh my goodness, like where is this person or whatever?
yeah,
Like you want it to be worthwhile.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, it's the people,
yeah.
definitely.
Man, that's I feel like that's a huge nugget of wisdom, and I feel like it could be splintered apart into so many other little nuggets because I mean, my dad has said this for as long as I can remember, but he said, with churches, God trusts churches with his most precious resource, which is people. I mean, for myself, having worked I worked through for a bunch of churches, across the country, and I have been pretty burned and pretty hurt in some situations, like mismanaged.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, like for a long time, like I swear I will never work for a church again. Like I won't be a key volunteer, nothing like that. And a lot of it was because people who were planning things didn't think about my capacity. I wasn't being cared for very
Mhm,
well.
mhm.
Right. And so I love the heart. Like I love hearing what you're saying because I think it's such a big reminder that, you know, everyone who attends a conference, whether they're attending it as a recipient or whether they're actually showing up as a volunteer, like God has a special experience he wants for each person there. And we have to remember that, especially for volunteers,
Yeah,
because like we have to think about, okay, what's our volunteer capacity? Are we showing our volunteers, like, how are we demonstrating our care for them?
yeah.
Um, and like, yeah, I just love, just like, you can tell you're a mom of like young kids. Like if a kid has an accident or if they make a mess while they're eating, is there time to change? Like, like
Yes, yeah, yeah.
that's the real stuff right there, man. Like,
Yeah,
and there's too many people, and maybe actually this is what you're getting at. Um, I think a lot of pastors are visionary and like, okay, I have a great vision of what I want this to be. And
mhm,
have a great vision of the impact I want this to have in people's lives. But what I'm hearing you say is you have to balance that with the reality and the kind of unfun reminder, I guess, is that people are like difficult things happen and
yeah,
people have needs, and like the plan never goes really, really well. And like making sure that you're working margin into a conference,
yeah,
if that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah,
And so I think as a pastor, I'm not that great at this yet, but as a pastor, I've had to learn how to take my own vision and my own desires and put them to the side for what people actually need. Cause those things
yeah,
honestly aren't always the same. Like,
yeah,
right.
yes.
So anyway, does that make
Yeah.
sense? What do you think about that?
No, no, I totally agree because I even think, like, even when it goes back to, like, building the team, like, as a pastor, like, the pastor can come with the vision, but, like, no one expects the pastor to come with the vision and then also, like, orchestrate this whole thing and, like,
Yeah.
make it happen, and that's why I think team is so important, and I think
Mm,
team helps with the capacity, team helps to avoid burnout, but also I think team comes with these different perspectives and, like, what you're saying of being a mom, like, I've said this for many years with, like, conferences. I was like, "I wish there was a mom on this, like, planning team." Because even, like, as a mom for myself, like, I forget what it's like to have babies. Like, case in
yeah.
point, I was, like, holding this, like, one-year-old this week to help a mom out, and I, like, offered it, like I was thinking, like, can this one-year-old eat potato chips?" I forget because my kids are not and so I was, like, asking, I was like, "Can a one-year-old eat potato chips?" And one's like, "No, they don't have teeth." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, of course." Like, obviously, when I was a mom with a one-year-old, I never would have and I would but you forget these things, and so I think,
You do.
if the
Yeah.
pastor or the people planning it have just teenagers and young adults, they forget, like, kids need naps or
Yeah.
because in the end, it's and I know I feel like we're just talking about naps and babies a lot here, but I think this goes into the whole thing of what value does the church family have for it?
Yes.
Just as much, I
Yes.
think, parents with or people who either are young adults or they have teenagers think about like, "Oh, my teenager's not gonna get anything from this," or what can we plan to
Yeah. Yeah.
incorporate, teens into it
Yeah.
or even like, the older generation that brings so
Yep.
much wealth and knowledge. Like how do we pull this like mosaic, beautiful picture of the church that the what
Mhm.
God wants
Yeah.
and that people are get such value from it. And so
Yeah. Oh
yeah, no, I
man.
totally agree.
No, that's awesome. I think the part of the takeaway maybe is that thinking about who is the conference for, and then have we thought about the experience of going to the conference from the perspective of that individual?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, yeah, because if it's a conference for elderly folks, you're probably not you want to make sure it's all on one level. It's all on one floor. There's not up and
Hmm.
down, right?
Yeah.
Making sure is like a lot of like it's simple and streamlined. It's not complex. You probably don't want to have a really difficult online registration system.
Hmm. Yeah.
And like thinking through that. Um, yeah, I mean, some of my my wife and I, like, yeah, we got 5 kids. So our youngest just turned 8. No, yes. He turned 8 in July. And then, my second youngest just turned 10 yesterday. And so, some of my closest friends are, a good amount younger than my wife and I. And so they have a little 1-year-old.
Good.
And it's told like, it's just, you forget just the changes that happen in a
Mhm.
house where it's like,
Yes.
oh, right. I forgot that they will eat anything on the floor that they can.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, okay, well, that's going to have an impact like on, and also like, yeah, like my friend Richard, if Rowan is around, like he has a limited attention span because Rowan doesn't like sitting through service, and
Yeah.
so it's like, he basically has to be up and around walking with Rowan wherever he wants to go. And like,
Okay.
so like, kind of taking your vision and taking your expectations, like, okay, tempering them and like passing them through the lens of, okay, the different people in your church.
Yeah.
Because yeah, that's part of showing love and showing care as well.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Man,
That's
that's so
good.
wild. Ugh. As a side note, I am like so glad my kids are out of diapers. Holy
Oh,
cow.
oh my goodness. Like when I see like pushing strollers and like, like bouncing like this, I was like, thank you, Jesus. Like I'm done with that
Yeah.
stage. Like I'm happy to help, but I'm
Yeah.
glad like they're
Oh yeah.
good.
Oh, totally. Totally. So, uh, okay. I'm trying to think if there's any other questions that we should ask or things we should talk to before we wrap up here. But, um, maybe encouragement. Do you have like any words of like encouragement um, just for maybe a pastor or a leadership team who are considering putting something on, but seems really daunting?
Mhm.
Yeah. What are some encouragement and some just kind of general wisdom that you would want to pass on?
Mhm. Yeah, I think, like, you don't have to start off big. Like, I think sometimes, like, a conference can just be a day conference or an afternoon conference, and you can kinda, like, test the waters. You don't have to have elaborate food. It could just be, like, coffee and cookies in the morning. But I think kind of testing the appetite of what your church needs or wants. Like, if you say you're gonna have an afternoon of just an extra, time of prayer and worship and teaching and just hanging out together and see what value comes from that. Like,
Mhm.
I think sometimes we're scared to get feedback because we think it's like we're opening this can of worms and now we're expected to like make everyone happy and tick every boxes. But I think, starting off small and talking to people like, did you find value in that? Do you think we could
Mhm.
explore something, maybe an overnight thing? But I think, yeah, it doesn't have to be something extravagant. Like we talked about church camps, like,
Yeah.
we always do ours in September when the summer camps are done. And you can scale it of like, do you want like full meals or do you want people to bring your own food? And like you said, I went to, for a few years, I went to a conference that was literally, it was in the UK and it was like literally like a field. And they just like brought in like porta potties and they brought in like the white tents and it was just very simple and basic. And people brought their own camping stoves and it
Yeah.
was great. It was like 3 nights and it was fun and it was like
Yeah.
you just expect it to be dirty and cold and
Yeah.
messy, but it's also like setting the expectations. Like I talk about in the article, like don't show pictures in your marketing of like this is my biggest pet peeve of like, like a turkey dinner and then you show up and it's like hot dogs and you're like, well, that was definitely not what we expected. And so I think
Mhm.
managing the expectations of what your conference is. And I think something that we always push in our church is like this is about like connecting with God and connecting with each other. And you know what? You might get cold and you might get wet and you're probably gonna get terrible sleep because that's the reality of these things, right? And the kids
Oh
are not
man.
gonna sleep well and your back is gonna hurt when you wake up in the morning. And like this is just what it is. But the important thing is that we're together and we're
Yeah.
encountering God together and we're
Yeah.
encouraging one another. And I think if as church leaders, like looking at that as the value versus like the details of like how nice and the aesthetics and like,
Yeah.
like we're a church in Vancouver, like downtown Vancouver. And so we have different ranges of like wealth in the church or
Yeah.
like families versus like single people who don't want to even be near children. Like we have all
Yeah.
of this, but we just emphasize like we're just going to come together as a church family and we're going to counter God together and it's going to
Yeah.
be great and we're going to spur one another on.
Yeah.
And if we focus as that as the value versus but it's a terrible camp, um that and so people come with that expectation. So it's just
Yeah.
managing the expectation and actually what the value you're going to get from it personally.
Oh man. Good words. Good words. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it was
That's
really
fun.
good. It was
Yeah.
super fun, and we definitely need to do more of this more often.
Yeah.
But yeah, hope you have an awesome day. Thanks
Yeah.
you very much for this, for you. It's great.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.